Imagine digging up a modern clockwork engine in a tomb from 100 BC. That is the scale of the impossible anomaly discovered off the coast of a small Greek island in 1901. We found a machine of gears and differential equations that was 1,000 years ahead of its time, a device that proves ancient civilization was on the brink of a technological revolution that simply vanished. This is the story of the first computer in history, and the tragic mystery of how humanity lost the keys to the future. Section 1. The storm, the divers, and the impossible lump. History often changes not by careful planning, but by accident. In the spring of 1900, the world was on the cusp of a new century, but off the coast of a tiny, desolate Greek island called Antikythera, the past was waiting to be woken up. A group of sponge divers from Simi, led by Captain Dimitrios Kondos, were returning from North Africa when a violent gale battered their vessel. They didn't want to be there. They were looking for shelter, not treasure. They dropped anchor off the jagged coast of Antikythera just to survive the night. When the storm cleared, they decided to make the best of a bad situation and search for sponges. One diver, Elias Dinis, donned his heavy canvas suit and copper helmet and descended nearly 150 feet into the blue. Minutes later, he signaled frantically to be pulled up. When he broke the surface, he was hyperventilating, his eyes wide with terror. He told the captain he had found a heap of dead naked women rotting on the seabed. He hadn't found a mass grave. He had stumbled upon the wreckage of an ancient Roman cargo ship, laden with marble and bronze statues that the centuries had eroded into ghastly shapes. It was the find of a lifetime. The Greek government immediately launched a salvage operation, pulling up breathtaking treasures, the Antikythera youth, bronze lyres, exquisite glasswork, and marble horses. The world was mesmerized by the art, but in the midst of this golden haul, nobody noticed a corroded, calcified lump of green rock the size of a shoebox. It was just debris, garbage. For 2 years, this lump sat in the courtyard of the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, ignored, while crowds gathered to stare at the statues. Why would they look at a rock when they had the gods in bronze? It wasn't until May of 1902 that archaeologist Valerios Stias walked past the lump, which had begun to crack apart as it dried out. He noticed something embedded in the interior. It wasn't stone, it was metal, and it wasn't a coin or a jewelry clasp. It was a precision-cut, bronze gear with tiny triangular teeth. Stop and think about how impossible that moment must have been. This shipwreck dated back to roughly 60 or 70 BC in the established timeline of human history. Gears like this simply did not exist. The technology required to cut metal teeth, that small and that precise, wouldn't be seen again until the clockmakers of the Renaissance. More than a millennium and a half later, it was the archaeological equivalent of digging into an ancient Egyptian tomb and finding a modern internal combustion engine. Scholars immediately dismissed it. They claimed it must have been a piece of modern machinery dropped from a passing ship that coincidentally landed on the ancient wreck. It was too advanced to be old. It violated the linear progression of history that says we started primitive and slowly got smarter. But as the crust fell away, revealing more gears, scales, and inscriptions, the terrifying truth settled in. This wasn't a mistake, it was a masterpiece, and it was about to force us to rewrite the entire history of technology. Section 2. Cracking the code. Cliffs reveal the ghost in the machine. For decades, the Antikythera Mechanism was a prisoner of its own fragility. The sea had turned the bronze into something brittle and chalky, fusing the delicate internal moving parts into a solid mass of corrosion. If you tried to pry it open to see how it worked, you would destroy it. It was a puzzle box that would crumble if you touched it too hard. So, for nearly half a century, it kept its secrets. It sat in the museum, a silent, calcified mystery. While archaeologists argued over whether it was an astrolabe, a navigational tool, or just a piece of junk, the real breakthrough didn't come from digging in the mud. It came from looking through the stone. In the 1950s, a British physicist and historian of science named Derek J. de Sala Price became obsessed with the lump. He sensed that the visible gear on the surface was just the tip of the iceberg, but he needed a way to see inside the rock without breaking it. He turned to the most advanced technology of his time, gamma-ray radiography. When the first grainy, ghostly images came back from the lab, the scientific world was stunned. The X-rays revealed that the mechanism wasn't just a single gear wheel, it was a sandwich of layers. Deep inside the corrosion were shadows of dozens of other gears, stacked on top of each other, with a density that rivaled a modern Swiss watch. But even Price couldn't see the full picture. The images were 2D, flattened and overlapping, making it impossible to trace the gear trains. It wasn't until 2005 that we finally stripped the mechanism naked. A team of international scientists, calling themselves the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project, brought an 8-ton, state-of-the-art, X-ray tomography machine specifically built for this purpose into the museum in Athens. They blasted the fragments with high-resolution X-rays, creating a 3D digital model that allowed them to fly inside the artifact. What they found was terrifyingly complex. They counted at least 30 distinct bronze gears, ranging from large drive wheels to tiny pinions. They found axles, pointers, and scales, but most shockingly, they found text. As the X-rays peeled away the layers of crud, thousands of tiny Greek characters emerged, inscribed on the covers and the internal plates. It wasn't just a machine. It came with a user manual. The text described the rising and setting of stars, the movement of planets, and the timing of eclipses. The 3D models proved that this wasn't a simple tool for navigation. It was a computer, a dedicated, analog computer, designed to calculate the cycles of the cosmos. The complexity of the gear train suggested that the makers weren't just guessing. They had mathematically modeled the universe and then built a bronze engine to simulate it. But why? What exactly was this engine telling them? To find out, we have to look at what appeared on the dials. Section 3. The Celestial Simulator, Predicting the Heavens with Bronze... If you were a Greek astronomer standing on the deck of a ship 2,000 years ago, and you turned the small wooden handle on the side of the Antikythera mechanism, you weren't just winding a clock. You were holding the universe in your hands. The front face of the device featured a large, circular dial representing the zodiac. As you turned the crank, pointers representing the sun and the moon would sweep across the sky. But this wasn't a simple fixed rotation. The Greeks knew the heavens were messy. They knew the moon didn't move at a constant speed. It speeds up when it is closer to Earth and slows down when it is further away. A phenomenon we now know as Kepler's second law of planetary motion. The problem is, gears move in perfect circles. So how do you make a perfect circle represent an imperfect, elliptical orbit? This is where the genius of the device becomes truly frightening. Inside the mechanism, the makers built a pin-and slot system. 2 gears were stacked on top of each other, slightly offset. As one turned, it drove the other via a pin sliding in a slot, causing the output gear to speed up and slow down at precise intervals. They didn't just track the moon, they mechanically simulated the variability of its orbit. They captured the physics of gravity using bronze teeth. But the back of the machine was even more specific. It contained 2 large spiral dials, looking almost like record players. The upper dial tracked the Metonic cycle, a 19-year period used to reconcile the lunar calendar with the solar calendar. Why does that matter? Because without it, your religious festivals, your harvest times, and your contracts drift out of sync with the seasons. This machine kept time for society. The lower spiral was the Saros dial. This is where the machine turned from a calendar into an oracle. The Saros cycle is an 18-year period that predicts eclipses. If you spun the dial forward to a specific date, the mechanism would tell you not only if a solar or lunar eclipse was going to happen, but exactly what time of day it would occur, and even the color the moon would turn red, black, or gray. Think about the power that gave the owner. In the ancient world, an eclipse wasn't just a shadow. It was a terrifying omen from the gods. It could stop a war. It could topple a king. If you possessed this box, you didn't just know the time. You knew the mind of the gods before they did. You could predict the moment the sun would vanish. And just to ground this cosmic computer in human reality, there was a small subsidiary dial that tracked the 4-year cycle of the Panhellenic Games, including the Olympics. It tied the movement of the stars directly to the movement of athletes on the ground. It was a theory of everything, combining astronomy, mathematics, and sociology into a single interface. But as we stare at these functions, a nagging question starts to form. It's one thing to observe the sky and write down the math. It is an entirely different thing to cut metal to match that math. To build this, you need more than just a smart astronomer. You need an engineering tradition that history tells us shouldn't have existed yet. How did they physically make it? Section 4. Engineering the impossible. Technology that shouldn't exist. To understand why this machine keeps modern engineers up at night, you have to stop looking at the diagrams and start looking at the bronze itself. Specifically, you have to look at the teeth. The Antikythera Mechanism isn't big. The entire device was originally about the size of a large dictionary or a shoebox. Into this tight space, the makers packed gears with teeth no larger than a millimeter. These weren't rough, hand-filed jagged edges. They were equilateral triangles, cut with uniform precision. Consider the challenge of making the main gear for the Soros cycle. This gear had to have exactly 223 teeth to match the 223 lunar months in the eclipse cycle. How do you divide a circle into exactly 223 equal slices by hand? If you are off by even a fraction of a millimeter on the first tooth, by the time you get around the circle to the last tooth, the spacing will be completely wrong and the gears will jam. You can't just eyeball it. You need mathematical division and high-precision tooling that we didn't think existed in the 1st century BC. But the real impossible feature isn't just the cutting, it's the architecture. Buried deep within the mechanism is a set of gears that performs a function indistinguishable from a differential gear. A differential is a complex arrangement that allows an output shaft to turn at a speed determined by the input difference between two input shafts. It's the same technology used in the rear axle of your car to allow the wheels to spin at different speeds when you turn a corner. History books used to tell us that the differential gear was invented in 1827, yet here it is, sitting in a lump of corroded bronze from the era of Julius Caesar. It was used to mechanically subtract the position of the Sun from the position of the Moon to determine the Moon S phase. It calculated the difference between two variable inputs in real time. This level of miniaturization and complexity implies that the Antikythera mechanism wasn't a prototype. You don't build a laptop as your very first attempt at a computer. You build a room-sized calculator first. The Antikythera mechanism is too refined, too elegant, and too small to be version 1. It suggests a lineage. It implies that there were likely hundreds of these devices, or at least dozens of predecessors, that were built, used, and refined over generations. So where are they? Where are the other bronze computers? If the Greeks had the technology to build differential gears and analog simulators, why were they still fighting with spears? Why didn't this kickstart an industrial revolution 2,000 years early? The existence of this device proves that the Dark Ages didn't just happen because we stopped moving forward. They happened because we fell backward from a height we didn't even realize we had reached. And if this was the pinnacle of their engineering, we are left with one burning question. Who was the genius standing at the workbench? Who had the mind to design the future? Section 5. The search for the genius. Who built the first computer? When you hold a masterpiece, you naturally look for the signature. Who was the Einstein of the ancient world capable of dreaming this up? For a long time, historians pointed to one man, Archimedes. Archimedes was the greatest mathematician of antiquity. He lived in Syracuse in the 3rd century BC, and was famous for his mechanical inventions, levers, pulleys, and the famous claw that plucked Roman ships out of the sea. Roman philosopher Cicero even wrote about a sphere built by Archimedes that could reproduce the motions of the sun and moon. It seemed like an open and shut case. The timeline fit, the genius fit, but the Antikythera mechanism itself tells a different story. When researchers analyzed the Greek inscriptions on the device, they noticed something specific about the language. The month names used on the Corinthian calendar dial weren't from Syracuse, where Archimedes lived. They were from the region of Epirus, or perhaps the island of Rhodes. Rhodes is significant. In the 1st century BC, Rhodes was the intellectual capital of the Mediterranean, a hub of astronomy and engineering. It was the home of Hipparchus, arguably the greatest observational astronomer of the ancient world. Hipparchus is the man who discovered the precession of the equinoxes and crucially was the first to mathematically model the variable motion of the moon. Remember that pin-and-slot mechanism that simulated the moon's changing speed? That is a direct mechanical translation of Hipparchus's lunar theory. It is almost certain that the maker of the Antikythera mechanism was using Hipparchus's math. Wait, it gets closer. The famous Stoic philosopher Posidonius had a school in Rhodes during this exact period. Cicero, the Roman writer, actually visited Rhodes and studied under Posidonius. He later wrote about a device made by his friend Posidonius that sounds suspiciously like the mechanism found in the shipwreck. So, we have a likely location, Rhodes. We have a likely theoretical architect, Hipparchus, and we have a likely workshop, the school of Posidonius. But this leads to a sobering realization. This wasn't the work of a lone mad scientist hiding in a cave. This was the product of a thriving academic and industrial center. It was a high-end luxury good, likely commissioned by a wealthy Roman patron or a Greek elite. It was meant to be shown off. It was a status symbol of intellectual dominance. The ship that carried it was a massive grain freighter, a Titanic of the ancient world, heading for Rome. It was loaded with booty-looted art and treasures intended for a Roman triumph or a rich man's villa. The mechanism wasn't steering the ship, it was cargo. It was boxed up, perhaps with a user manual, being shipped to a buyer who wanted the coolest new gadget from the East. The genius wasn't just one man. It was an entire ecosystem of knowledge that flourished in the Hellenistic world. And that makes what happened next even more tragic. If this was a product of a thriving industry, how did we lose it so completely? Section 6. The Shipwreck of Doom. How the knowledge was lost. The irony of the Antikythera Mechanism is that the only reason we have it today is because of a disaster. Sometime around 60 BC, that massive freighter carrying the device ran into a storm that makes modern hurricanes look tame. The ship was smashed against the cliffs of Antikythera, dragged down by the sheer weight of the marble statues and bronze bullion it was carrying. It settled deep in the sediment, hidden from the world. If that ship had made it to Rome, the mechanism likely wouldn't have survived. It would have been displayed in a villa for a generation or two. Maybe a child would have played with it and broken a gear. Maybe the owner would have gotten bored of it. But eventually, as the Roman Empire began to crumble and resources became scarce, that device would have faced the ultimate enemy of history, recycling. Bronze is valuable for the next 1,000 years. As civilization collapsed into the Dark Ages, people didn't look at a complex machine and see science. They saw metal. They saw a sword, a pot, or later, a cannon. Almost every large bronze artifact from the ancient world was melted down and repurposed. The Colossus of Rhodes, melted. The great bronze roofs of Roman temples, stripped and melted. The Antikythera Mechanism survived only because it was lost. The ocean protected it from the smelter. But this brings us to the more terrifying realization. The physical object was lost to the sea, but the knowledge of how to build it was lost to silence. How does a civilization simply forget how to build a computer? It happens easier than you think. This was high-end, bespoke technology. There probably weren't thousands of engineers who knew how to make one. There might have been only a handful of workshops in the entire world capable of this precision. If a plague sweeps through Rhodes, or if a war disrupts the trade routes, or if the library containing the blueprints burns down the chain of transmission breaks, technology isn't a straight line that always goes up. It is a fragile flame that needs to be fed. When the Roman Empire fell, the economic networks that supported high-level astronomy and precision engineering collapsed. People stopped caring about the minute movements of Mars. They started caring about survival. The expensive, specialized tools needed to cut those gears were abandoned. The math was forgotten. We know that some of the knowledge trickled east. We see echoes of this gearing technology appearing in Byzantine clocks and later in Islamic science during the Golden Age of Islam, where scholars like al-Biruni built geared astrolabes. But the complexity of the Antikythera Mechanism, the differential gear, the variable motion simulation was lost. It's a sobering thought. We assume that once we invent something, it stays invented. But history shows us that we can regress. We can have the keys to the universe in our hands, drop them in the ocean, and then spend the next 15 centuries walking in the dark. We didn't just lose a gadget, we lost 1,000 years of progress. And that leads us to the final, haunting question. What else is down there? Section 7. The Great Silence. 1,000 years of forgotten science. It took humanity nearly 1,500 years to catch up to a lump of bronze found in a shipwreck. Let that sink in. The level of technology found in the Antikythera Mechanism, specifically the differential gearing, and the precise clockwork trains did not reappear in Europe until the astronomical clocks of the 14th century. That is a millennium and a half of silence. That is 50 generations of humans living, working, and dying without the technology that had already been invented. This device forces us to confront a phantom timeline, a ghost history that never happened. We know that the Greeks had the gears. We know they had steam power. Hero of Alexandria built a spinning steam engine called the Aeolipile. Just a few decades after this mechanism was made, they had the math, they had the mechanics. They were inches away from an industrial revolution 2,000 years ago. Imagine a world where this technology wasn't lost. Imagine if the Romans had applied these gears not just to the stars, but to carts, to mills, to pumps. We might have had trains by the year 1000. We might have been on the moon by the year 1500. Instead, the gears stopped turning, the metal was melted down, and humanity hit the reset button. The Antikythera Mechanism is more than just a computer. It is a warning. It stands behind the glass in Athens as a testament to the fragility of progress. It proves that knowledge is not cumulative by default. It must be protected, practiced, and passed down, or it vanishes. We like to think of ourselves as the masters of the world, sitting at the apex of history with our silicon chips and our artificial intelligence. But the makers of this mechanism probably felt the same way. They looked at their bronze computer and thought they had conquered the universe. And then, in the blink of an eye, a storm, a shipwreck, and the slow decay of time erased their genius from the face of the earth. Today, we are left with 82 corroded fragments and a realization that shakes the foundations of our confidence. The most advanced piece of technology from the ancient world wasn't a sword or a temple. It was a computer, and for 15 centuries, we forgot it ever existed. It makes you wonder, if our civilization were to fall tomorrow, and the oceans were to rise and swallow our cities, what would the divers of the future find in the wreckage? Would they find our hard drives and know who we were? Or would they find a rusted, unreadable lump of plastic and silicon, and wonder if we, too, were just a myth? The Antikythera Mechanism teaches us that the future is not guaranteed. We held it in our hands once, and we let it slip away. The challenge now is to make sure we don't drop the keys again. Section 8. Conclusion. The story isn't over. Cliff's dad would read him. Cliff's dad would read him Harry Potter, because he couldn't do it himself. Cliff's dad would read himself. Cliff's dad was his hero. Cliff couldn't. It would be easy to end this story here, looking back at what we lost. But the ocean hasn't finished speaking yet. The wreck of the Antikythera is not a closed chapter. It is still an active crime scene of history. In just the last few years, marine archaeologists have returned to the site with technology that Captain Kondos and his sponge divers could never have imagined. They are using exosuits, essentially wearable submarines, that allow them to stay at depth for hours, gently brushing away the sediment that has hidden the rest of the ship for 2 millennia. And what they are finding is changing the story again. They haven't just found more bronze or marble. Recently, they discovered a human skull, jawbone, and teeth buried in the sand. It belonged to a young man. For the first time, we have the biological remains of someone who was on that ship. Scientists are currently attempting to extract DNA. If they succeed, we won't just know what was on the ship. We might know who was on the ship. Was he a sailor, a merchant, or perhaps the astronomer accompanying the device to Rome? They have also found a bronze disc with the image of a bull. And rumors persist of other large metallic signals hidden under boulders that have rolled down from the cliff face. Some experts believe that the mechanism we found is just part A. There might be a part B. There might be a planetary drive system that is still sitting there, encrusted in the seabed, waiting to complete the puzzle. The Antikythera Mechanism reminds us that history is not a static list of dates. It is a living, breathing mystery that is constantly being rewritten. Every time we think we understand the limits of the ancient world, something like this rises from the deep to prove us wrong. So, the next time you swipe the screen of your smartphone or look at the complex gears of a watch, remember the nameless genius Inroads, who sat by the Aegean Sea 2,000 years ago. He looked up at the stars, did the math, and built a machine that captured the universe. He may be gone, and his civilization may be dust, but his gears are finally turning again. If you want to join us as we uncover more lost chapters of human history, make sure you are subscribed. There are more shipwrecks, more mysteries, and more forgotten worlds waiting for us to find them. Until next time.